ultimately, if you don't believe that people actually should be enjoying themselves in, ways that are potentially addictive or slightly risky, then you're not going to be impressed by harm reduction.
I signed up to Greenpeace and they instantly sent me literature about three-eyed fish because of nuclear energy. I was just a kid. We're not taught about this at school. I would say to people, well, what about wheelchairs? Do you think, well, what about medicine for ill people? And some of the more extreme people would just say, those people have to just die out then.
Free market capitalism has improved the world so unbelievably dramatically that it should almost be the only thing anyone ever talks about.
Hello, welcome. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us for this panel discussion. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Communications Manager and Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thank you all very much for joining us for this panel. We are here to mark the publication of our new paper, Not Invented Here, which effectively discusses an area which I think is particularly interesting, in which single-issue pressure groups often argue against the solutions for the very problems that they claim to care about. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by various different experts in this field. We've got Dr. Christopher Snowdon, who many of you will already know. Chris is the IEA's head of lifestyle economics. He is the author of books such as Polemics, Killjoys, Selfishness, Greed and Capitalism, The Art of Suppression, various others. And he is also one of the authors of this paper. We also have Zion Light, who is a science communicator, writer and activist, and who was also a member of Extinction Rebellion, one of the spokespeople. From 2018 to 2020, Zion was one of the spokespeople at Extinction Rebellion, and she set up and edited the XR newspaper Hourglass. We're also going to hear a bit about Zion's chapters in the paper Not Invented Here, as well, specifically on food and the environment. And we're also delighted to be joined by Julian Braithwaite. Julian is the CEO of the International Alliance for Responsible Drinking. And, after 30 years in the public sector, including 6 years as the UK's ambassador to the World Health Organization and other international organizations in Geneva, Julian is now the CEO of the International Alliance for Responsible Drinking, which brings together the leading beer, wine and spirits companies around the world to tackle the harmful consumption of alcohol and promote moderation. Thank you all for joining us today. We're going to give each speaker 5 minutes first for our introductory remarks, and then we'll enter into a panel discussion. You will also have a chance to enter into the Q&A as well. Chris, off you go.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Thank you all for tuning in tonight. Not Invented Here syndrome. This is really a sort of phrase taken from the corporate world, really, where corporations tend not to be very keen on using stuff that's already been made by other people. It's also very common in the NHS. In fact, if you remember the COVID app, which we could easily have borrowed from Google and Apple. Before I talk about Not Invented Here syndrome, have you ever heard of Bieder-Meinhof syndrome? Can I do it? Yeah, I have. Okay. The Bieder-Meinhof syndrome is the idea that once you first hear about the Bieder-Meinhof gang, the 1970s socialist terrorists, you suddenly hear about them all the time. In the same way that if you buy a black BMW, you suddenly start noticing black BMWs all the time. In the same way, incidentally, during the pandemic, some people kept noticing that young athletes had suddenly died. There was no actual increase in the number of young athletes who suddenly died. It was that some people were really looking out for it. And it's the same thing with Not Invented Here. Once you become aware of the concept, you start seeing it all over the place. We've got 6 examples in this little booklet here. E-cigarettes, low in alcohol drinks, GM foods, nuclear energy, housing, and was that 6? I don't know, 6. Anyway, you've got it on your chairs. But since then, I noticed another one the other day. There was some sort of vaguely anti-alcohol researcher didn't like the idea of sobriety tags. Sobriety tags are these things that they put on people who have been convicted of various crimes that were usually something to do with them behaving badly after having a drink. And they get let out of prison early on the basis that they wear these sobriety tags around their ankles, I think, generally. And it picks up alcohol in the sweat. So basically you're told you can stay out of prison as long as you don't drink any alcohol. And this particular academic didn't like the sound of it, thought it was a bit stigmatizing. And she said, really, we should be banning alcohol advertising. That's the way to really deal with alcohol-fueled violence, is stop people seeing adverts for Heineken. And she said also there's no evidence that these things work. And then she actually went off and conducted the research to see if there was any evidence. She came back a few weeks ago saying, yeah, actually, they did work. But I still don't like them. We should ban alcohol advertising, yeah. Matt Ridley, who I asked to come along tonight, unfortunately he was busy. He sent me an example of somebody who apparently has created or invented genuinely biodegradable plastic, but it's been banned on the basis that we should be using plant-based plastic, which is much more expensive and requires a huge number of plants to be wasted, essentially. It comes up all the time, and I guess the question we try to answer in this little book is why? Why are these people like that? Why are these campaigners who have devoted, in many cases, decades of their lives towards solving a problem, why are they so resistant to quite obvious and pragmatic solutions to those problems? I think there are several possible reasons, and I think all of them probably have some merit. One is simply these people are genuinely mistaken, that they really do believe that these things are not actually solutions, or that the benefits will be outweighed by the costs and so on. But I can't really swallow that, because these people, as I say, they spent decades, certainly years, looking at these issues. There's no way anybody who is obsessed with an issue can genuinely believe that low alcohol drinks are in some way some sort of date rape drug in Africa, which is what the WHO suggested last year, or that or they're gateways to drinking, or that e-cigarettes are gateways to smoking, or that nuclear energy is more dangerous than any other form of energy. There's just no way that they can actually believe that. And if they do believe that, they're obviously kidding themselves. There is also the possibility economists would be quite keen to consider, which is that it's kind of a self-interest. You know, who needs tobacco control academics if there's no more tobacco? You know, if tobacco is phased out, or the cigarettes become obsolete through the free market, then we're not going to need any of these public health academics. I think, again, there's probably some truth in that. On the other hand, we've seen with the slippery slope that these people are quite capable of shifting to different issues and applying their dubious skill sets to other things, gambling and alcohol and whatever it may be, sugary drinks. So I'm not sure that explains most of the objection. I think actually what it comes down to is just different conceptions of the good life, really. It's a moral thing, ultimately. If you don't believe that people actually should be enjoying themselves in, ways that are potentially addictive or slightly risky, then you're not going to be impressed by harm reduction. If you think that actually people consume too much and that people need to stop traveling as much as they do and need to go back to a more kind of nomadic existence, then you don't want to have plentiful energy. Same with organic farming. Some people just don't like the idea of fertilizers. They think that we should be living what they see as being a traditional lifestyle, and so they would rather attempt to have the whole world live off organic food than solve the problem in an easy and scientific way. And I guess all those are examples of these people go for incredibly unrealistic goals. But that's the problem. And this is why these people are a problem, if they have the ear of government, is that the things that they want to do, their institutional preferences, are either totally unrealistic or would be incredibly damaging, or both. So the solutions are essentially the total prohibition of tobacco, which the government is literally pushing through, albeit in a strange and gradual way at the moment, or overthrowing capitalism. Well, I suppose that is possible. Countries have tried doing it, but it's not really much of a solution to anything, let alone environmental problems. So these people want to remake society in a way that, if it were even possible, would be incredibly damaging. And they shouldn't be listened to just because they spent a long time campaigning against this problem. I think ultimately there are a significant number of activists, not all of them by any means, a lot of them are perfectly pragmatic, and we've got one here, who they kind of prefer the end game. They prefer the institutional goal to dealing with the actual problem. And some of them probably joined the movement because they quite liked the end game, which was often this overthrowing capitalism or ending consumerism or stopping people enjoying themselves, whatever it may be. And people join activist groups, I think, for different reasons. And we need to be aware of that. And it's only, as I say in the paper, it's only when suddenly there's a pragmatic solution. It might not be a total solution, but it will at least significantly alleviate the problem. If you see resistance to that from people who had claimed for a long time to be really, really concerned about this problem more than anything else, then I think you are justified in doubting their sincerity. I'll leave it at that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chris. I think it's particularly interesting when we're thinking about those particular solutions that maybe to us are particularly obvious, but to many of those campaign groups aren't, or at least they don't prefer those particular solutions. Zion, you've got 5 minutes.
So, yes, I am the former spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion, but actually my activism goes back much further than that. I'm one of these people who was concerned genuinely about the environment, about environmental causes. I grew up worrying about the ozone layer, problem that we fixed using science. And when you're concerned about these issues, there's only really one place to go. You go to Greenpeace, you go to Friends of the Earth. And I was involved in all of these organizations. I was involved in smaller organizations like Camp for Climate Action, which doesn't exist anymore, but was very, very active doing direct action years before Extinction Rebellion was doing the same thing. I was involved in Amnesty International. I used to volunteer for Oxfam. I did all of the things that, we kind of think of as those are the good things to do. These are the good organizations. These are the good guys. And I still think that even with awareness of some of these organizations have done some things that aren't so good, even so, we still have a perception that they're the good guys. Most of us do. And that's because they market themselves and they brand themselves as really good organizations. But what if I tell you that I was only a kid, so only 13, 14 years old, kind of getting interested in these issues, and I signed up to Greenpeace and they instantly sent me literature about three-eyed fish because of nuclear energy. I was just a kid. We're not taught about this at school. They don't teach a program about nuclear energy at school. Or about radiation even. And these groups really feed on that fear, that radiophobia that, again, many of us kind of naturally have. And it's sensible to have some awareness of this. It's sensible to think, none of us want to live through an atom bomb exploding. We understand that. But everything in the world comes down to the quantity, right? The dose makes the poison. So it's true with radiation. In small quantities, actually, it can be very good for your health. And nuclear medicine saves millions of lives, but in some examples where it has been damaging, they use that, and they use that by taking natural fear, a generation's natural fear of weapons after they saw the consequences of what happened in Hiroshima, for example, and they use that to turn people against energy as well. So I had that fear, even though I didn't grow up around that time. And I'd learned about this in history at school, but I didn't grow up with this fear of I didn't grow up in a Cold War. But a lot of the people in these organizations had. C&D as well, that was another group I was in. A lot of them were older people, and they genuinely had this fear. But it was all coming from organizations. It was not a natural fear, but it was feeding on a natural fear. And you see the same thing with gene editing or genetic modification. So for years, I was fed the same information from multiple different groups, from all of these groups, actually. WWF, that's another example, very heavy campaigners against nuclear energy telling you the same misinformation. Once you've heard it for years and years, it's very hard to break out of that. And actually, it can become a part of your identity. And I think, that feeds into what Chris was saying about, well, why don't they then accept other solutions when they come along? Well, because it's such a big part of your identity. It's almost like a religion. It's hard to leave that. It's hard to step away from that and say, actually, I attended anti-nuclear protests. That's a hard thing to do, is to step back and say, well, I was wrong. Right? So, and then I did do that. And then I lost my entire community. And I'm talking about people that I campaigned with, that I went on TV to bat for, that I blocked roads with, that I was arrested for. completely turned on me, well, you're just an industry shill. And I would say, you're not welcome in the environmental movement. That's what I was told. And I would say, I earned my stripes in this movement. You don't get to decide what it is, actually, because the causes are legit. We should care about these causes. That's why we solved the problem with the ozone layer, right? We came together, we worked out we need to ban CFCs, we worked out a way around it, way to do it, and then we watched it heal. We didn't even know that would happen. But the solutions are there in almost every instant. There is almost nothing that humans can't solve. You know, we've got an asteroid hurtling towards Earth. We're working out solutions for when it comes back around and may or may not hit us. So going off tangent slightly, but basically, okay, to wrap it up. So I was in these groups. I was told genetic modification is bad, organic is the solution. Nuclear energy is bad, renewables are the solution. And you're fed it again and again. And I actually did start to question it, but I was actively shut down when I did question it, because when you question it, you're questioning someone else's religion. Well, why are you asking that question about nuclear? That's not welcome here. I was actually told that in the Green Party, and I quit. I left the party because I didn't like that they didn't let me ask a question at a public event where they were discussing energy. And I just wanted to ask the meta-scientists on the panel, well, what do you think of nuclear? Because I've heard a lot of bad stuff about it. And they didn't let him answer the question. They said, we already know it's bad. The host said, we already know it's bad. And he didn't get to answer. But I tracked him down afterwards because now I was angry that they didn't answer, even if it was just to confirm what I already thought, which is, yeah, we don't need it. Renewables will do everything. And I tracked him down and I said, can you answer my question? And he said, well, of course, we can't just do it with wind and solar. The IPCC says that. It says we need nuclear as well. So this was like a really brain-shattering moment for me where my whole world crumbled, because I thought, if they've lied about that, what else have I been lied about? And as I say, stepped away and was completely rejected by many of these people, many of the older people. A lot of the younger people actually are a bit more sensible now, I find, and they kind of looked into it themselves and said, yeah, we don't understand why this is such a big problem. But they still have these groups coming at them with the same myths that you've heard for decades, kind of influencing them. Oh, well, maybe it is safe, but we just don't need it, and all this other nonsense, which is, goes against the scientific consensus that they then tell you to follow. Literally, that's what we would say in Extinction Rebellion. Follow the science, but not that science over there. Follow the science in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, the 1.5 warming report, where it tells you that this is a climate crisis and we have to deal with it. But the chapter on mitigation by Working Group 3, we're going to ignore that because it says you should use nuclear and you can't just have wind and solar without nuclear. So that must have been because, somebody lobbied the scientists. That's what I dealt with for years. And I did step away and I did start being vocal about it, mostly because people were afraid to, because the attacks you get when you come out and speak for these things were pretty awful back when I started doing it. It's much less common now because it's become much more acceptable and people are willing to have this conversation. And, there's quite a lot of support in the UK, for example, for nuclear energy and gene editing. But it's been a hard slog to get here. It's been... I can't over-explain how much they keep you in their religion. They keep you in, essentially, I did write a piece saying it's basically like a cult, because as soon as you voice anything different, you're out. And that was my experience of a lot of these groups. And it's why I essentially broke with all of them, from the Green Party through to Extinction Rebellion. And, as Chris has already covered and is covered in the pamphlet there, it's because they don't really want those solutions. They don't care that organic farming requires more land and therefore is actually worse for the environment than using the fertilizers. They don't care about that. They live in this religious type kind of fervor that is based around the living on the land fallacy, which is about we all go back to nature. We live a simpler life. Science has taken that from us. So actually, we need to work out how to get rid of all these technologies. Which is, of course, absurd, because literally everything is technology, from your clothes to your glass to my glasses. We live with these aids that are very beneficial to humanity. And if you really dig deep, it's very dark, actually. If you really dig deep into what these groups believe, I would say to people, well, what about wheelchairs? Do you think, or what about medicine for ill people? And some of the more extreme people would just say, those people have to just die out then. And that's where I really just said, I can't be part of a movement where some of the main people in this group, he's in jail at the moment, actually, which is why they're not doing that many actions, but he's the main driver. You know who I'm talking about. I worked with him, and he genuinely believes what I'm saying, but he just doesn't care. Well, if lots of people have to die, they have to die. And I think that's really tragic. And I come from a completely different perspective, which is that we should use technology to lift us up. And it's very beneficial, actually. And none of us want to live on the land. And all the people that most shout for it are the ones that live with the privilege of not having to wash their own clothes and grow their own rice like my parents did in India before they migrated here in the 60s. So, yeah, there's a lot of different reasons, but I do think essentially it's from the people that believe that. And then they feed it to everyone else. And if you're young or you're just susceptible, to misinformation, it's very easy to believe something that you're told in many different ways by many different people over a very long period of time. So do give them a little bit of grace for, it's not their fault necessarily that they're fed essentially what is propaganda, but we do need to keep up the calling it out and creating pamphlets like this, for example, because there's still a lot of people that are interested in environmental causes and think, oh, wow, I want to do something about climate change. And where do they go? They go to these groups. And these, a lot of these NGOs are not actually the good guys.
Thank you so much, Sai. I mean, that was really powerful. Yeah, give her a round, of course. And also, it takes a particular person to be brave enough to speak out within those groups. So I think that's really wonderful to hear and really interesting. Moving on to Julian. So, I mean, obviously, when it comes to things like responsible drinking, there are millions of people across the UK that responsibly drink anyway, and yet a lot of the activists that campaign against problem drinking end up advocating for policies that affect everyone. So, if you've got 5 minutes, tell us.
So I'm going to tell you a story about the World Health Organization and Not Invented Here. And it's a story that in my 6 years in Geneva, when I was, amongst other things, the UK's ambassador to the World Health Organization, I wasn't aware of. And that tells you something about how these very big international bureaucracies that have little units doing different things can be sort of operating out of sight of, the oversight by different member states, but having very significant impacts on the sort of international regulatory frameworks that affect industries. And the WHO, I thought, when I went to Geneva, it'd be the World Trade Organization would be the organization in Geneva that would be most significant for business, obviously, because, the clue's in the name. But actually, the one that really has the most impact is the World Health Organization, whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's alcohol, whether it's food. A whole host of industries are basically governed by an international framework that is set at the UN level by the WHO. And the story begins quite positively. It begins in 2010 with the Global Alcohol Strategy to reduce the harmful use of alcohol. This was agreed by the World Health Assembly, which is the international body of all the member states that agrees policy. And it's a good strategy. It talks about tackling the harmful use of alcohol and distinguishing that from moderate consumption. So moderate consumption is fine because, in terms of, there's a debate about whether a little bit of alcohol is good for you or bad for you, but either way, it's statistically insignificant. So moderate consumption is fine. Harmful consumption, excessive consumption, that's a problem. You should have a strategy that tackles that. Fine. Good. Distinction. The second thing that it's based on is this thing called the whole of society approach, which is you bring together all of the key stakeholders. It's government, it's civil society, but it's also industry, and they all work together on the problem. So as an overall strategy, it's a good strategy. And the companies that went on to form the organization I'm now the CEO of, the International Alliance for Responsible Drinking, these are the companies of sort of leading beer, wine and spirits companies globally, the Diageos, the Pernod Ricards, the ABIs of this world. They came together, having talked to the Director General of the World Health Organization, because back then that was fine, that's what they did. They came together and said, right, we're going to come up with these producer commitments which are going to support the implementation of this global strategy. And they committed their global organizations with all of the resources they have in terms of marketing, the ability to innovate, develop new products like no and low alcohol products. they committed to this strategy. They committed to what they could do to tackle underage drinking, to promoting moderate consumption, responsible consumption, and supporting whole of society approaches to tackle harmful drinking through targeted interventions by government. So they came out with these set of producer commitments. It was a great example of industry coming in behind this strategy. When I was looking into this job and understanding what had actually happened in WHO, what happened almost immediately afterwards is Margaret Chan never spoke to these companies ever again. And I was trying to work out why, the relationship between the industry and the WHO sort of just broke down at that point. And really, there have been these dialogues that have happened, but in terms of that level of engagement between the leadership of the WHO and the industry leaders of the global beverage alcohol industry, nothing's happened since. What actually happened was a statement of concern that was sent to Margaret Chan just a couple of months, a few weeks after these set of producer commitments, signed by literally the list of all of the people you could imagine in public health and in academia. There were professors and knights and all the rest of it. Went on and on. None of them from the UK, actually. It's a very Anglo-Saxon thing here. So the UK, some Canadians. Anyway, a huge long list of very eminent people who all said that it was really unacceptable that industry was supporting the implementation of this global alcohol strategy because of the conflicts of interest, because they couldn't be trusted to do so, and it was wrong for the WHO to have this relationship with them. And Margaret Chan never spoke to them ever again. And the strategy is still in place, but the WHO has sort of gone down this journey since then, where now two things have happened. They've actually sort of internalized this idea that industry is part of the problem, not part of the solution. And part of it is because they've taken a leaf out of the tobacco control policies, which were adopted with this framework convention of tobacco control in the early 2000s. And actually many of the people who are working on that in the WHO are now working on alcohol policy. And, when you've got a regulatory hammer, everything looks like a nail. So they've been basically saying that the problem of tackling the harmful use of alcohol is to apply the same policies that are applied to the tobacco industry. So ban advertising, ban marketing, put up prices through taxation, exclude the industry from any form of policy engagement or dialogue or implementation, and graphic warning labels. So literally they've taken that regulatory playbook and applied it. And there's a sort of an alcohol control light version of that called the best buys, which is what the WHO thinks is the way in which you achieve progress in tackling the harmful use of alcohol. But they've done two things. First of all, they've said that the only way in which you can really tackle the harmful use of alcohol is through these best buys, which are sort of tobacco control policies applied to alcohol. The second thing that they have done is to say, actually, the only way you can really measure progress in reducing the harmful use of alcohol is by targeting per capita consumption, so the average use of alcohol. So this has become the new metric that the WHO has adopted, which is it's only if you lower average consumption around the world that you're actually tackling harmful consumption. Now, the great irony there is there's a bunch of UN metrics that the WHO is required to collect, which includes one which is you'd think is very appropriate when it comes to tackling the harmful use of alcohol, which is alcohol attributable mortality. And the WHO collects this data and last June published a report which included all of the data they are required to collect, which you wouldn't know it from the report, actually shows that there's been a 20% reduction in the in alcohol attributable mortality since 2010 through to 2019. It is nowhere in the report, it's not in the executive summary, it's buried in data in the annex that we've had to sort of dig out. And instead what they say is alcohol per capita is not coming down fast enough, we're not going to meet the UN target, and the best buys are not being implemented, and therefore we have a crisis, and what we need is an advocacy campaign globally to push these best buys and to raise the profile of this crisis. Completely independently of the fact that the data on the harmful use of alcohol shows that this program, obviously it varies from different countries, right? But globally, it's moving in this incredibly positive direction. But they don't talk about it. So, one of the interesting questions is how does a an organisation that is set up to be the guardians of the science, the guardians of the objective data on this, end up in a place where they're sort of pushing an agenda or almost an ideological position, which is sort of now disconnected from the outcome that the strategy was set up to achieve. And it's Chris, you've got some examples of that. They are, at one level, they're very susceptible to these lobby groups, the public health lobby and sort of academia, who, for the reasons I think, Chris, you alluded to, have a particular ideological position on this. It's also, the same people end up actually being recruited into WHO. So the alcohol unit of the WHO has people who previously worked for some of these pressure groups, many of which have very long and distinguished histories as temperance organisations, but have rebranded themselves as public health organisations, public health NGOs, combating non-communicable diseases, which is the sort of the framework within which all of this fits. And so they've sort of rebranded themselves as NGOs campaigning to tackle non-communicable diseases. But then when you look at them, they're basically former temperance organisations, and they're campaigning organisations. And there's people who have worked for those organisations now work in the alcohol unit in the WHO. There's these sort of connections which also help explain it. But it's the answer for us as the industry is the good news is actually both the science and the data are on our side, and so we are focusing on continuing to sort of communicate that and to ensure that we are getting out the evidence of what we've done, how it contributes to actually contributing to tackling harmful use. We're the ones going around actually publicising the WHO's own data that showed that we're making progress in this area. But it's a funny state of affairs where, it's taken us to actually go out and pull out perhaps the most significant data that the WHO has been reporting on this field globally and actually say, this is actually what is going on. There isn't a need to change the policy from tackling harmful use through a whole of society approach that involves industry. We don't need to move to just tackling average consumption, because actually there isn't a strong correlation between average consumption and harmful use. And we don't need to exclude the industry, because actually the industry, through its innovation, through the fact that its brands are the way in which you can reach consumers, and the responsibility campaigns that these companies are running are part of promoting the moderation that has actually led to the progress. So we'll see how this plans out. There's a UN meeting in New York towards the end of this year, which will review all of this. One of the things we wanted to make sure is that actually the WHO's own data ends up getting put in front of the diplomats who will negotiate this text and potentially shift the overall policy towards this more tobacco control policy. Now, there are people pushing for that, and these pressure groups are pushing for that. But ultimately, it'll come down to people who are based in New York who aren't immersed in this, a bit like in the way even when I was ambassador to WHO, I wasn't immersed in this. So there is, the arguments can be made, and that's what we're seeking to do. But it's an interesting story about how an organisation that was set up to be an intergovernmental objective organisation has in this area sort of been captured by this particular rather ideological approach pushed by some very ideological organisations, many of whom had their origins in the temperance movement.
Thank you, Julian. I think what's really interesting about the Not Invented Here syndrome itself is that it's effectively, in a nutshell, the institutional preference towards anything that is more interventionist. So, for example, more taxes, more bans on various things. Anti-market, so any sort of solution that comes from the industry that they see the problem as coming from, they are anti that solution itself. I think no greater example than that, than the fact that a lot of the tobacco industry have created products that are lower risk, and so any of those products are not liked by those particular activists. And also, indeed, any kind of solution that is predominantly going to result in people having less choice, I think is interesting in this syndrome. I'm going to ask a couple of questions to the panel, and then we'll throw over to our question and answer as well. Chris, do you think that the government itself has sort of become absorbed by this Not Invented Here syndrome? Of course, we've got the Tobacco and Vapes Bill, in which the government is seeking to reduce smoking rates itself. Of course, the only country in the world that has actually resulted in what we call smoke-free, less than 5% of a smoking population is Sweden, not by banning tobacco, but actually by allowing adults to choose safer and healthier products such as snus. So do you think that the government itself has been captured by this syndrome?
I think that it does. Absolutely. I mean, Julian mentions you get activists working in WHO. Of course. I mean, it's the ideal job. If you're an activist, you want to become a regulator. And it's not that difficult to become a civil servant. There's a lot of civil servants, and you get in there. And so, of course, it appeals to people who have an agenda. And the Department of Health ultimately creates health policy. It's not the health secretary. How many health secretaries you had in the last 10 years? It's the Department of Health writes this stuff up, and occasionally you get a health secretary who says, no, we're not going to do that. But most of the time they immediately get native and they do it. I mean, the tobacco and vape bill is a very good example, actually, of this particular thing, because what you have is, this whole little pamphlet is about institutional preferences, which are ideological, impractical, and probably disastrous, versus pragmatic solutions. Tobacco vape bill, you've got the pragmatic solutions: heated tobacco, snus, nicotine pouches, vapes. Clamp down on all of those, ban most of those for everyone born before a certain year, and with tobacco, ban it completely. Because you've got prohibition, which is the unrealistic and disastrous institutional preference, and on the other hand, you've got a government that actually is more pro-vaping and the reduced risk products than most governments around the world. Still clamp it down. They're still going to double the price of my veg juice and ban disposable vapes in June. So yeah, it's absolutely, Rishi Sunak didn't come up with this idea. Wes Streeting didn't come up with this idea. He was activist within the Department of Health.
Interesting. And Zion, specifically on nuclear energy, what made you come to the conclusion that nuclear energy itself is one of the many solutions? I mean, you wrote about it very coherently in that chapter in the paper about the fact that nuclear energy itself is one of the most safest and reliable forms of generating energy. Could you explain a bit about that?
Sure. So, I mean, it is the main, if you want clean energy and you want it to be reliable, you want your lights to stay on, but you don't want to completely change civilization so that you're capping your energy usage, which is kind of what some countries like Germany have sort of put in place, rationing during the energy crisis, saying don't have a shower for longer than this, this length. Then, yeah, nuclear is the only solution. Otherwise, stick with coal. But we know that coal is very polluting. We know that we do need to transition away. There is no greater discovery, in my opinion, than the ability to split the atom. That happened here, by the way, in Britain. But yeah, so I was fed lies for a long time, and then I just naturally started to question it. I had some friends who questioned me who were not in those circles. But as I say, it took me longer than it should have to come around to it, because I was surrounded by people who kept saying, well, that's false. Well, you're being told lies by those people. Well, we won't platform these views. No, you can't ask the questions. So it's very hard actually to get the correct information. It probably seems odd now because we have Google, but actually it wasn't that. Yes, I am that old. It wasn't that common back then. You couldn't just find out easily. I just had this literature that was false. I did have to go away and read the IPCC report. I have a scientific background, so I was able to do that. I think for a lot of people, it's not possible. So I went to the source and I went, actually, what that it comes down to that scientist, which is why I gave that example earlier. He said this, and I've now looked at it and it's true. But as I say, your whole world kind of comes crumbling down. And I think some people would think that, and then they just put it aside. It doesn't matter because we still save the whales. We're doing other good things. That thing doesn't matter. But actually these groups and their concerted long-term efforts globally to protest clean energy, to protest nuclear energy is one of the major reasons why climate change is still a big deal today. It is. We haven't been able to decarbonize because these bans came into place.
Do you mind if I just ask you a question for a minute? Because it was very what you were saying. Economists like to believe that people are basically irrational. And we did redefine rational to allow for a fair bit of irrationality, but we like to think that people basically are rational. And in your opening remarks, you were using phrases like it's a religion, it's a cult, people are brainwashed and so on. Do you think these people are fundamentally irrational in a cult-like sense?
No.
No. So what's the agenda?
The most rational thing, if you look at evolutionary biology, it's the most rational thing to stick with your tribe. What I did was irrational. It was. That's why hardly anyone does it. I had to start again. I had to leave behind all of these people. I was literally writing for these magazines. I lost all that work. I was speaking at these events. I lost all that work. You have to step completely away from everything you know. It's completely irrational. But because I started doing it back in 2020, and then other people came forward and started doing it, I went to two of the major papers in the UK, which, by the way, the editors were on the fence, anti-nuclear. And I said, let me write about nuclear. All of your previous pieces are anti-nuclear. And they said, well, no, we're not anti-nuclear. We're just concerned about radiation, all the usual stuff, Chernobyl. And I said, let me write a bit. And I really heavily argued with them. And they only let me, these two papers, they only let me because I said, I'll write about why I left Extinction Rebellion. And they wanted to hear that. And those were the first ever pro-nuclear pieces in those newspapers in the UK. And because of that, lots of other people suddenly, including in those papers, started saying, oh, yeah, I agree. And I believe this too. And it suddenly became acceptable. Just from that, I noticed a big change. And then suddenly everyone's saying, well, she's the rational one, which is interesting, right? Because it wasn't at all.
Rational speaker in community. Thank you, sir. And Julian, very quickly before we go to Q&A, why do you think then that, what do you think is the ultimate solution then to a lot of these institutional problems that that the industry itself is facing, but also then on the flip side, all the public health campaigners that are arguing for more of those bans and taxes? What do you think is then the solution?
So, I mean, the immediate one in my particular world is actually to make sure that member states are more involved in the discussion, and it's not just left to the WHO. And you need to raise this issue up so that the individual countries take a view on this rather than just leaving it to the experts in the WHO, because it turns out the experts in the WHO are not following the science and are pushing public policies that aren't actually delivering the outcomes. So, that's why this event in New York, this meeting in New York, is so important, because you're taking it out of the world that's the Geneva world of the WHO, and you're taking it into a place where it is possible that actually, if you do have the facts on your side, you will be able to get a more of a fair hearing. And we've had to organise to do that. There are within governments, you also have different perspectives. And the other thing that we've tried to do is ensure that the views of not just the experts in health ministries are the people who are actually determining what the policy is. Again, with something like this, it's very technical. Within governments, it will often stay at a expert level in the expert department. The problem with that is that's where this rather ideological agenda has taken hold. And so you need to raise it up so that actually it is discussed in terms of the context of, how is it that you actually achieve the objectives? What does the science actually say? I mean, there's been fascinating debate in the US in the context of something called the US Dietary Guidelines, which is the US regulatory policy on alcohol and health, but also on across food, etc. And the Health and Human Services Department, so the US equivalent of the Department of Health, had commissioned a report which was basically written by scientists who take a particularly ideological position on this and are pushing this concept that there's no safe level of alcohol consumption. So you can't distinguish between moderate consumption and harmful consumption. No safe level at all. Every drop of alcohol increases your risk of cancer. You may have read that in some newspapers. There's a particular group of scientists who are pushing that. It's not borne out by the science if you assess it objectively. And Congress commissioned a report by the National Academy of Sciences to say, can you review all of the science of alcohol and health in a properly and thorough methodological way and just tell us what it says overall in terms of this issue? And this group came back and said, actually, when you go through all of the science, it basically says that people who drink moderately will live at least as long as people who don't drink at all. So there is this, protective effect of low levels of alcohol, and that's confirmed if you look at all of the science. So if you're not pushing a particular part of science that pushes your particular ideological agenda, and you look at all of it, the facts are still on the side of this distinction between moderate consumption and harmful consumption. So, it does come back though that researchers in this area are, if they disagree with this sort of growing orthodoxy amongst the activist scientists that there's no safe level of consumption, if they sort of speak out against that, then they are outside of this orthodoxy. They find it difficult to get funding. So it's interesting how that dynamic works against basically an objective assessment of what the science says. But as I say, within the US, there's this fascinating debate, and actually they did come out, and the facts are what they are.
Amazing. Thank you, Julian. Let's go to Q&A. We'll take 3 questions at a time, I think, and then we'll throw back to the audience. We have the mic at the back. We do. Excellent. Let's go to the front here, Martin. If you could say your name and I'll start.
Hi, Martin Cullip. I've been coming here since 2009. I'm a donor now. I just wanted to comment on what Julian said about the evidence being suppressed. I'll just give you an example, which is perfect for this panel. France has just banned nicotine pouches. It has a smoking rate of 29%. Its youth smoking rate is 13%, but they've banned the least harmful product that you can buy that contains nicotine in France. I mean, that is just utterly absurd. But what I want to point to is why do we have politicians who don't seem to get this idea of the evidence being taken away from them? The Tobacco and Vapes Bill currently going through specifically refuse to consult with consumers and with industry. And yet the politicians' first instinct was to ban something. Sure, do they hate the public that much that their first thing is to ban something without actually consulting everyone and looking at all the evidence before they do that? It is really appalling that that's the first thing. Let's ban it. They should be speaking to everyone rather than just listen to these activists before they ban something.
Sort of the consumers were ignored, I think, is interesting. Let's take all these questions. So here, over here, and then just in front there. Yeah, these two.
Hi there. My question's hopefully very simple. We've talked about solutions. That means that there's a problem. But everyone has a different perception of what a problem is. Surely, in what the IA believes, each problem is individual, and that individuals come to their own solution based on the information that they know. Everyone knows something different. So how do we think that a collective solution is applicable to all individuals? And that relates to all the questions in your debate on the floor.
And then just behind it.
Thank you, Richard Diamond. So much of what I've heard over the last few minutes sort of resonates with my experience over a very long time. I expect I'm the only person here who grew up within about half a mile of a nuclear power station on the north coast of Anglesey, and our reluctance to have nuclear power or develop nuclear power, I'm sure, is one of the reasons our energy security problems. But my real concern is work I've also been involved in, going back a decade or so ago, about infrastructure development in this country and the way that's been blocked. And to what extent the panel feel that one of our real problems about our low and poor performance in terms of economic growth over the last few decades has been down to the willingness of government to listen to some of these arguments, which results essentially in nothing ever happening in this country.
I did mention it, but my colleague, Christian Niemitz, who also wrote the foreword to this paper, wrote the chapter on housing, effectively on this idea that despite the fact that the solution to a lot of the housing issues that we face, the housing crisis, we're all very aware of the fact that it exists, it means that we can't build anything in this country, but the government end up either pandering to NIMBYs or indeed wanting to impose things like rent controls, which ultimately increase those costs and decrease supply. Let's get another question at the back, and then we'll throw to the panel. Who else had questions? Hands up. Okay, Let's take that one at the back there, and then we'll throw it back to the panel.
Would you agree that one of the activists' main ploys is the LNT thing, which Diane knows very well about? This is the linear no threshold idea, that you've got to reduce these things that they object to zero level. No level is safe. Well, it's quite well known that radiation levels can be much, much higher. Safe background levels can be 400 times higher than they are in the Thames Valley. Same thing goes for PM 2.5s and the ULEZ nonsense. People evolved in higher radiation levels than they want to impose. Same for PMs and everything else. And I'm sure that applies throughout all the speakers' comments. And the government just looks for something it can politicise, legislate and tax.
Excellent, thank you very much. Do either of you want to take any of those questions? We've got a couple on evidence, problems being based on individuals. Yeah.
I mean, you make a very sound point, sir. That, should we even see these things as problems? In terms of the government, some of them probably shouldn't be seen as problems, not problems that the government should be getting involved in. I've long said that smoking and drinking and obesity are not actually public health issues at all, properly defined, because they're not contagious, apart from anything else. Nevertheless, I think you could say that it is a problem that people who smoke get lung cancer, right? It's a problem for them. It doesn't have to necessarily be a problem for the government. And indeed, the government doesn't need to be involved in solving that problem, because we've got the free market who's producing things like these, which are now being banned in France. On the other hand, climate change, assuming you accept the evidence on climate change, that is a problem that can only be solved through collective action. And starvation is definitely a problem that the government can do something about, and governments that are banning golden rice are exacerbating that problem. So your point about basically zero tolerance in a world in which there have to be trade-offs and there have to be costs and balances. The idea that you go for zero is absurd. The idea that there are some activists who go, I think they call it Vision Zero or something. No one ever dies on the roads. This is simply not going to happen unless the cars only go at 10 miles an hour, right? That doesn't make me pro people. The fact that I don't want to have a 10-mile-hour limit everywhere, or indeed a 20-mile-hour limit, as they have in Wales, doesn't make me in favour of people being killed on the roads. I just accept that in order for society to function and for people to move around at speed, unfortunately, people will die. And the solution to that, well, there isn't a solution. Solution is the wrong word. The correct response to that is basically a harm reduction one. Wear a seatbelt, have sensible speed limits, and it's exactly the same with alcohol and smoking and many of these other issues. It's an ideological position to say that there should be zero risk. No one actually believes that in their own personal lives. Even these Puritans, I don't think, really try and maximize their longevity to that extent. And the idea that, one drink a year presumably kills you, right? I mean, that's a logical extension of this. Any alcohol ever in your life somehow puts you at risk. Firstly, it's scientifically untrue. In fact, it's the opposite of the truth, because moderate drinking actually is good for you. And nicotine, let's face it, is almost certainly good for you if taken in a clean way. And these anti-smoking people have gone from being there should be no smoking to there should be no tobacco to there should be no nicotine. This is a fanatical and ideological position that has no basis in science and absolutely no basis in ethics.
Either of you want to come in on any of those questions?
So I think this risk point's really important. I mean, and it's absolutely true in this debate about alcohol policy. No safe level, is you can't. It is true. You can't say. So the scientists argue that there's no safe level alcohol consumption. Say that every molecule of ethanol increases your risk of cancers, and if you're a woman, it increases your risk of breast cancer. So even just a glass of red wine a week increases your risk of breast cancer, and that's true. What isn't true is the risk. So what they don't say is what is the actual risk of that, and public understanding of risk is. I mean, it's very easy to people actually understanding risk is complicated, and it needs to be, how do you explain it to the public? And you have to be a statistician. There is actually a guy called David Spiegelhalter who was indeed the professor for the public understanding of risk at Cambridge University, and he used to get very irritated, does still get quite irritated about this idea that there's no safe level of alcohol consumption, because his point is, well, in that case, there's no safe level of eating bacon, because all of these things have small risks, which obviously, if you're just eating, a small amount, has absolutely no impact on your health. So there's something about the understanding of risk in all of this, and I think the activists are deliberately playing on the fact that people don't understand risk, and so they say there's no safe level, and they say things you can't actually deny, which is, yes, every drink increases your risk of cancer, and people are obviously terrified about anything that increases that risk of cancer. So it's a very powerful message, and it's very difficult to rebut unless you get into the statistics of risk, which, because what the public policy around this should be around giving people good information about how they can understand the risk. And that's why the concepts of drinking guidelines were created. The CMO drinking guidelines say, 1 to 2 drinks, or in the US, it's 1 to 2 drinks a day. Standard drinks a day is fine. And so that's what the public health authorities tell you. And so ordinary people know, right, if I drink within that, the risks to me are very small. What's being attacked now is the very idea that there should be those guidelines, that actually public authorities should provide that information to the public about what are guidelines within which it is relatively, in practice, safe. And that, so actually the public policy in this space is sort of being undermined, because that's really important. If what we're talking about is giving people the information so they can make choices about how to drink responsibly, if that framework comes under threat and people say, well, you can't give any advice because all alcohol is harmful, it does a massive disservice to the public and to actually sensible policies that help people manage these risks effectively and drink moderately and responsibly.
Is there anything else you want to add any of these questions?
Yes. So I wanted to answer Martin's question, and also it kind of feeds into what Chris said earlier. Why don't people follow the science? So this is my field, and actually I didn't answer your question properly, because you said, are these activists less rational than other people? But if we're talking about science literacy, are they less science literate? My experience is that most people aren't very science literate, and that's backed up by data that about 10% of the country has a good level of science understanding, according to the modelling that we use within science communication, looking at basic understanding of, for example, scientific principles like scientific consensus. So, and that's not actually a UK thing. That's quite a broad thing across the West, that you typically don't get a lot of people in these fields who really understand the data. So you can put all the data you want in front of someone, but it's very hard for most people to actually sift apart, what's a good study versus a bad study. This study has 5 people and that has 1,500. That to me is kind of, something obvious, but most people, they're not capable of doing that. And I'm not saying that as a derogatory thing. It's a hard thing to do. We're not wired to do this. We're wired for, and this feeds into the idea of risk perception. Why are we so bad at risk perception? We are. Most of us don't worry about getting in a car. Actually, statistically, you're much more likely to get in an accident than flying, but most of us have a fear of flying. It's like just like an inner feeling, really, isn't it? It's a bit like the living on the land fallacy. It feeds into our confirmation bias. I have vibes about this. I have a fear about this. I have a fear that, nuclear kind of is scary. I don't really understand how it works, and that things did happen with weapons. Alcohol, it does make you feel bad if you drink too much. Probably there's something in that. Maybe it is making you sick. And it's interesting because both of these things, which are very different things, the alcohol thing is very different to the nuclear energy. The fear that the activists feed on is cancer. In both instances, the radiophobia that people use, people kind of feed with their narratives in the anti-nuclear space, it's all about cancer. It's all about you'll get sick, and look at what happened to these people that got radiation poisoning. And all of those things are real and they're true, that they happen not from energy, but from weapons. But most people can't make that differentiation. They don't understand the difference. And again, frankly, we're not teaching this very basic stuff in schools. Unless you go on to study it, you don't learn this. It's very easy then for someone else to control that narrative and come in with scary stories. And we are very receptive to stories. Of course we are. We are storytellers. This is just a human thing. And if someone comes in with a really good, clever story and someone else comes in with a 20-page, document with figures and graphs, which one are you going to believe? You're going to believe the one that tells you a story. It might not be a nice story, might be a scary story about some little kid who suffered from cancer because they had a power plant and it was all scary. This is a real story, actually. It's called Die Wolke, and it's a German book. It's a science fiction book, and it's taught across German schools, and it has been for decades. And I actually think it's one of the reasons that Germans are particularly so fearful of nuclear, because I read that book just out of interest. It terrified me. It terrified me, this poor little girl, and she watches her, and her family dies, and she has to bury her brother, and then she gets radiation poisoning, and then people are like discriminatory towards her because her hair falls out. It's terrible. It's a terrible story, but it's feeding on real fears of real things that happened. And then we feel that that's more true than that 20-page document, which I'll probably flick through, but won't necessarily understand. So there's an issue of science literacy, and therefore getting ahead of data when it comes out, as you said, getting it in front of the right people, but explaining it. Because frankly, I've spoken to politicians who have low science literacy. They don't have a clue. You talk to them about nuclear and they're like, oh, well, isn't it bad? I read something from this report. Yeah, Greenpeace wrote that report. We need to look at sources. We need to look at sample sizes. We need to look at the full literature, the full spectrum. And if you're not sure, then get someone in who can do it, not someone from an activist organization, because they'll have their own biases, whether they're doing it intentionally or not. Although, as I said, a lot of them are doing it intentionally. Their purpose is to scare you. And then you can make a rational decision. Now, a lot of these people have documents in front of them on every different issue, and they don't have the ability to go through or the capability to go through each thing and work out for themselves what's true and what isn't true. Because I read in this paper that just one drink, and then I know someone who died and they did have one drink, and that's it. But that is literally what happens with everything in this pamphlet, and far more issues. It happens with every new technology. It's happening now with AI. AI is going to take your jobs and it's going to destroy the world, and there'll be AGI and the robots will control us. And it sounds ridiculous, but people truly believe it. They might not think too much about, the extremes of that logic and think, well, that's ridiculous. They just kind of live over here, going by vibes. I will get in a car, but I don't want to go near a nuclear power plant. You sleep next to someone at night, you get more radiation exposure from that person than you do from walking around a nuclear power plant. You can measure it. We're very lucky we have tools where you can do that. But that's already a step beyond the feelings, right? I'm already explaining beyond the feelings. So it's really important that actually, and I say this because I do think some of it is on the scientists, some of it is on the rest of us, because we don't get ahead with the stories, and I believed all the stories. And then I started telling news stories. They're true stories. But I started telling news stories, and I even had some scientists and some nuclear scientists come out and say, well, you can't say, there was one phrase that I popularized, which was nuclear saves lives. You can't really say that, Zion, that it's a bit misleading. And I said, no, it's not. It's the title of a paper produced by the grandfather of climate science, Professor James Hansen, right? He wrote a paper, he calculated the number of lives left when Germany banned nuclear and Japan banned nuclear and then went back to burning coal. And he calculated it to be around 1,000 a month. And he said, that's real data and all of the numbers are there for you to see. And then they said, oh yeah, well, we didn't know about that. Carry on. But actually there was some gatekeeping there, because sometimes the very technical people don't want you to tell stories. But let me tell you something, if you don't tell the story, the other side will, and they will be believed. And then it is very hard to fix once those beliefs are ingrained. You're just firefighting. You have to get ahead with this sort of stuff, really. And all I do most of the time now is firefight. And if you don't believe me and think I'm exaggerating, consider nuclear. What do you think when you think of nuclear? Because most people think waste. That came from activists. You don't think waste when you think about coal, but There's waste. It's stored in the Earth's atmosphere, right? We breathe it in. There's waste. It's not managed. Nuclear waste is highly well managed, ridiculously well managed. It's stupidly well managed. It's so stupidly safe. It's so boring. I know. I've been there. I've looked at the cast. Is that it? Really? I spent 10 years afraid of this thing because I was told the waste, and we all believe it. We all believe it. Anyone new that I speak to about nuclear, what about Fukushima? What about Chernobyl? What about waste? It's always the same things. That messaging came from somewhere. And it's on us to tell the better stories to get people back to somewhere a bit more reasonable using the data. But to be honest, the data is not that important. It's the story that's important.
It's communication. What's interesting actually is that this is this idea that there is no safe way to use nuclear energy. There is no safe way to drink alcohol. There is no safe way to use nicotine. When actually, in fact, we know from the evidence that that isn't the case. A few more questions. Yes, we have a microphone at the front. Loud voice. For the recording, we'll leave.
It's Harry Phibbs. Many of us, when we who our evaluation of nuclear safety rely on having watched episodes of The Simpsons, which might be unreliable. But what I wanted to ask was about the activism for fair trade, which was more fashionable 10 or 20 years ago than now, but people who would feel that the way to help the poor would be to refuse to buy things where people are very low paid, people work in bad conditions, and so in practice saying, right, we should buy our coffee from Mexico rather than Ethiopia, or we should buy our clothes made in Europe rather than the sweatshops in Bangladesh. And there is the broader area of consumer boycotts, investment boycotts, advertising boycotts. Obviously can involve conservatives as well as socialists. A lot of conservatives say, well, we should be patriotic and buy British, and there could be all sorts of different motives. And is that all just fine, fair enough, let people do what they want to do? Or, I mean, does the panel think that probably the best idea morally is for us to allow the market to work and just buy what we want to buy that we think is best value?
Brilliant. Let's go behind Harry and yeah.
Hello, I'm Sheldon Wilkie. I'm really interested in the idea of small modular nuclear reactors and fusion technology. So I really wanted to know how realistic it is for this country to develop that technology, small nuclear modular reactors. Are there any countries abroad that have actually developed this technology? And furthermore, is there any way that we can actually develop fusion technology by allowing the private sector to invest in it? And I wanted to hear the views of the panel or someone who's got expertise in this area.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Sheldon. Any other questions? Right, let's take those two and then that'll be it. So this one at the front.
So Lee Roberts, how will this play out? Because we've had eras of extreme orthodoxies before that were addressed by the Enlightenment. How will this finally end up? Will it be a case of better education? Do we legislate how information, how data works? I mean, this age is supposedly the most enlightened ever because of access to data, but clearly we can't process this. So is it a human frailty that we cannot adjust to this much data, so we sort of fall back into myths and our own tribal reactions? How do we fix it?
Excellent, thank you. And I've got a question at the back.
Was that me?
Yeah, Bruno.
I'm Bruno. I'm one of the trustees here.
Do you want to use the microphone? Sorry.
Sorry, my name's Bruno. I'm one of the trustees here. I think Zion absolutely nailed it, but the point that it's about tribes. And the gentleman's quite right to challenge us because we're individualists. So how do you combine those two? I remember thinking when I first came here, I'd been searching for a decade for other people who were opposed to all the communal stuff that was being imposed on us. And I was looking for a tribe of anti-tribalists. It's a bit contradictory. But I think there's maybe a way for us to look at it that comes out of that, which is we need to think what these other tribes offer is very easy moral answers. They're moral, but they're wrong. we are sometimes don't talk about morality. Someone mentioned golden rice, the huge morality of the lives that could be saved and all these things. We should be more confident about that. And the other thing that people want from tribes, of course, is that sense of being a community. I think quite often we're rather middle class and shy about it. So everyone who's here, hopefully you are classical liberals, and hopefully you'll go away today and spread the word, be confident, say you are classical liberals, the IEA is the home of classical liberalism, please come and get involved and let's try and draw people in, because frankly we have been losing for 30 years and we need to start turning it around.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, any questions to respond to the design? If you want to respond to the small nuclear modulars, yes, you perhaps will be the best sort of panels
first. And could you? No. I just spoke at length, so. SMRs, small modular reactors. Do they exist? Can we build them? They do exist. We already use them. The technology exists. We use them on submarines. The challenge is to build reactors that we can build very cheaply and very quickly at home. So the UK has several companies already trying to do this, pushing for their models to be accepted, be the ones that we roll out, Rolls-Royce, for example, but there are multiple different companies. There's many global companies actually all vying for the same space, all vying to be the one that is built in that country, all making promises that it's around the corner, it's a couple of years away. May or may not be the case. I can't speak to that. But the technology does exist. So they essentially, it's not building it from scratch. It's building versions that we can build out. It has to be cheap. It has to be cheap and it has to be easy. It has to work with the supply chain. It has to be easy to build compared to regular big old nuclear because, as we know, there are a lot of issues with many different things. So we still need big nuclear. But the idea with SMRs is if you have a data center, which our government said we want data centers, which I think is good, we should have them. A good way to power that, instead of taking it from the grid, is just stick an SMR there next to it. And that they are planning to do that in America. And they're already kind of paving the way, saying these big companies, Meta and Google, are saying, yes, we are building the data centers, but we're also going to have the SMR. So you can leave this alone, basically. It's also a good model.
It's also the case the regulation is different in the US. And so if in order for them to be profitable in the UK...
regulation's a long conversation. So... Is it? So, I mean, the regulation for SMRs hasn't been set here yet. It's in the process of being set and it's looking promising. I'm involved a little bit in this, actually. And it's looking promising because they're trying not to put those things in place that have made it so difficult to build. I think someone referred to this before. Why can't we build anything? We can't build HS2 because there are bat tunnels. We can't build nuclear because, there are protesters coming from around the country to that region and saying they can't have those jobs. So, yeah, we're trying to get around the NIMBYism with the SMR siting. One of the things I'm advising on actually is getting the communities on board first, because actually the most pro-nuclear communities, and this is pretty much true for every country, including the UK, the most pro-nuclear citizens are the people who live by the power plants because they've grown up with it. They're not afraid. The scare stories don't reach them because they have real stories. They know people that work there, or they work there themselves, or they've been on a school tour or whatever. It's normalized to them. So, it's what I was saying about if you get ahead with the communication and you don't put in too much red tape, but we'll see, because there will be a lot of lobbying against that. We know that's going to happen. And we can't let what happened to big nuclear, where it's so stiflingly overregulated, especially with environmental regulations, ironically, we can't let that happen to SMRs. So there's a lot of stuff happening in that area, and we don't know for sure yet. But you can't compare it to US regulation because it's just so different per state, in fact.
It's really interesting. Thank you. Any other responses to some of those questions as well?
I'll try and answer your question, sir, about where's it all going to end. People who know me that I'm not naturally an optimist. In fact, I was just talking to Reem down the pub only 2 hours ago about my plans to move to the Falkland Islands when it all goes down here. But we have seen in the last few months what has been described as a vibe shift. For good or evil, who knows? But I think actually, broadly speaking, for good. I personally was one of those people who said it doesn't really matter what happens in America. We don't live there. Why are all these nerds so obsessed with the US presidential election? But, when Donald Trump came in, there was a quite tangible vibe shift on quite a number of things. And some of it was for the worse. And these ruined the stock market with these bloody tariffs, but hopefully he'll see sense. And I don't agree with his stance in Ukraine. But there has been, in terms of what is sometimes called woke culture and that kind of thing, it does seem as if that fad has gone. And perhaps this fad for the stuff that I write about, the nanny state, for want of a better phrase, it goes so far against what people actually want to do and what they really think and how they actually want to live, that it can only be a fad. And very quickly you might find, in the twinkling of an eye, suddenly there's a vibe shift, and that might change. And it will change with things like nuclear energy, where she's so obviously in the right, and I'm so obviously in the right, and eventually people will see this. Yeah, but it's a very good point made about telling stories. One of the reasons, and this comes a little bit to Bruno's point, we are very bad at telling stories. Free market capitalism has improved the world so unbelievably dramatically that it should almost be the only thing anyone ever talks about. And yet economists look at what happens in various different countries that apply free market principles, even a little bit. India and China have only applied free market principles a bit. They're still pretty bad countries in lots of ways, incredibly bureaucratic, and China's a one state. But just introducing some free market principles has massively improved people's lives. And free market economists, rather than go on and on and on about it, as they would do if they were socialists with some socialist state that for a few years looks like it might be doing quite well, like Venezuela 15 years ago, economists don't go on about all this, go, yeah, we thought that would probably happen. To give you one example, right? Talking about the absolute disaster that is prohibition. Was with alcohol, will be again with tobacco. Australia doesn't even have prohibition. It has prohibition of vapes, heated tobacco, and nicotine pouches. Any nicotine product apart from cigarettes. Very sensible, evidence-based approach to it.
Also the ban on nuclear.
Oh, does it?
Yeah.
One of the countries has a ban on nuclear as well. Yeah, remarkable. And they have got a full-blown tobacco turf war in America, where well over 2,000 arson attacks on various shops that simply refuse to sell the gang's illegal vapes and tobacco products. And a month or two ago, a woman, I think in her 20s, became the first civilian casualty of this. There have been other gangsters that's been killed. They don't really count, But the first innocent person died. I can't even remember her name. She should be, if we were effective, she should be a household name, If it was on the other side, if they could find somebody who'd been killed by a vape, which is still not happened anywhere in the world, we have Paul Danahan, the guy. I'm not that familiar with him, other than that he died a little while ago. When he died, it was reported across the media as being this guy who probably died from vaping. He died having taken 6 or 7 different Class A drugs or under-the-counter drugs, any one of which would be enough to kill somebody.
And also happened to have a vape, and therefore they accused them.
But also had an elf bar, and therefore it was
the elf bar that killed him.
We're very bad at, for want of a better word, exploiting these tragedies. But people, the public health people, the nanny state people, the Puritans, the zealots, they exploit tragedies all the time, often make them up. And we don't, because we're not very good at telling stories. We're very good at collating data. And as you say, it's not really much of a match.
Very interesting. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you to all of you for watching and listening, and thank you to our wonderful panel.